Hello, everyone. This is going to be 8.2. We are going to be continuing our look into the early days of the Washington and then Adams administration and go up through Jefferson and Madison as well. So, John Adams in 1812 said, "There are two tyrants in our simple, youthful, and beloved United States of America. These two tyrants are fashion and party." So, first, let's look at Adams. George Washington served two full terms, 8 full years, and he probably could have run for more. This is one of the things that we didn't have at the time. We had no term limits on our presidents, so you could run for 4 or 5 terms if you wanted to. However, he decided that he was done. He was tired. His farm was in disarray. And also, he wanted to set a precedent. He wanted to set an example for other people to follow and say, yes, presidents are not kings. Presidents should give up the power just like I am. And so he basically gave up a lot of political power as a precedent to set a precedent for other people to follow. He also, during this time, spoke out against political parties. He spoke out against getting involved in foreign wars. And then he gracefully sort of disappeared from the scene. And this was perhaps the most important moment of his presidency is the fact that it ended. He did a lot of important stuff, but one of the most important things he did is to say, we're not going to have a dictator in this country, ever. So this is the dome of the U.S. Capitol building, the painting that we see here, called the Apotheosis of Washington, the idea of Washington becoming a god. That's what apotheosis means. So he is almost godlike in his grandeur at the beginning of our country. Now, the question is, how do you follow a demigod? How do we get past that? Well, we have an election. And in Washington may have called for no parties, but by 1796, it was partisanship, both sides. We had political parties forming. And in a very close election in 1796, John Adams of Massachusetts, who was of the Federalists, beat out Thomas Jefferson, a Republican from Virginia. Adams was a brilliant man. He was an educated man. He was a lawyer. He was a patriot. He was a son of liberty. He was also stubborn and humorless and arrogant and really knew how to really rub people the wrong way, basically. And he got a lot of enemies thanks to his sort of being seen as sort of impatient and sour during his time. So, but he got enough people to become our second president, but he also made a lot of enemies along with it. So this is our second president, John Adams, president for only one term, 1797 to 1801, from Braintree, Massachusetts, where he had been a lawyer, he had been a member of the Constitutional Conventions, he had been minister to both the Netherlands and to Great Britain during this time, and he had been the vice president of the United States for 8 years under George Washington. And interestingly enough, he and Thomas Jefferson were great friends during the creation of the Declaration of Independence, and then they became bitter enemies during this time when like both of them wanted to be president. And then after a while, they both became really great friends again until they both died on the exact same day, July, July 4th, 1826. And his last words were, Thomas Jefferson still survives. Little did he know that Jefferson had actually died earlier that day. They're a couple 100 miles apart. It's hard to get word that quickly back then. Now, we hadn't planned to have political parties, so the Constitution, before we changed it, basically said whoever gets the most electoral votes gets to be president of the United States. Whoever gets the second number of votes gets to be vice president. So just imagine in our own modern, politically divided times, the president is of one party and the vice president is the head of the opposing party. That would just be so. A lot of fighting going on during that time period, I bet. And a lot of fighting going on back in this time period, too. John Adams was president, Jefferson was his vice president. They're of two political parties, of two political minds. Jefferson is an anti federalist, Adams is a strict federalist. And so this is going to be a bit of a problem. Another problem is the growing conflict between Britain and France in Europe. And we said we are neutral. This is what Washington said. We stuck by our guns with that. And we, as a neutral nation, have the right to trade with everybody. However, Britain and France said, no, you do not. And so they would stop us, they would board our ships, they would take what they needed, including they would take people off of those ships in what we called impressment. Now, Adams sent people to negotiate a new treaty with France. Um, and when they went to go see the French ambassador, a guy named Talleyrand, they were met by three men who demanded bribes in order to meet with the French ambassador. They said, "Yes, if you want to meet with our ambassador, I'm not going to do a French accent. What am I doing? You have to pay us roughly $250,000." And our men said no. And we refused to also name the three guys who did this. The three anonymous men who demanded the bribes were called Messieurs X, Y, and Z. And so this nearly brought us into war with France at this time. And so here's a political cartoon of the XYZ affair. You see people like cutting off heads in the background. You see this pirate kind of guy up in the with the many heads, trying to get these American diplomats to pay up and things like that. And so we were on the verge of war. In fact, we did sort of engage in naval warfare with the French. We would defend our ships if the French tried to board them. And so this turned into what was called the quasi-war with France. However, Adams was not eager to jump into another war. The problem for Adams is that this war was quite popular. A lot of Americans felt very upset that they had tried to take advantage of us. They had tried to board our ships, that they had demanded bribes from us. A lot of Americans were actually kind of on the war bandwagon, but Adams decided he was going to negotiate a peace. And that was actually kind of unpopular for him to do. And so this actually lost him a lot of support. And also, the Republican dissent at home kept on, and also he dealt very poorly with his political enemies. He tried to perhaps get a little too much power within the federal government. In 1798, Adams passed the Alien and Sedition Acts, and these were aimed directly at his Republican opponents. This was him not even trying to hide it, basically. The Alien Acts, these are two separate laws. The Alien Acts extended the naturalization process to 14 years. So if you wanted to become an American citizen, it would take 14 years. And it said that John Adams and the federal government had the right to deport anyone that they saw as dangerous. And what made them dangerous? It was kind of left up to them a little bit. The Sedition Acts made it illegal to criticize the government. What does it mean to criticize the government? Well, that was also left particularly vague at this time. And so several newspaper editors were actually imprisoned due to this act because, if you called John Adams a stupid head, that could technically be enough to throw you in jail. And Jefferson called this time period the reign of witches, thinking that Adams was really something devilish during this time. Now, these acts were meant to silence the critics of the Adams administration. However, instead, it riled them up. So, new papers and magazines were created. We saw new people criticizing the Adams administration for this sort of dictatorial practice. And meanwhile, Jefferson and Madison worked to create what were called the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. These especially Kentucky. Kentucky was a brand new state that was being formed at this time. And the idea was that they wanted to create a line in a state government that basically said state laws could overrule national laws that they didn't like. And this is going to be important. This is going to be something that fires up a lot of people in the future, too. The idea that, like, a state can just ignore a federal law that they don't like. Now, while the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions did not pass, many Americans were very upset with the way that John Adams was acting at the very least with a very firm hand, and at most acting like a dictator would, to silence his enemies. So in 1800, Thomas Jefferson beat Adams in a pretty handy election. He did pretty well for himself. However, through a weird sort of quirk of the Constitution, both Thomas Jefferson and his running mate Aaron Burr got the same number of electoral votes. We've actually made this pretty much impossible these days. And also, this brought along the idea that you now run as a president and vice presidential ticket instead of as two different people. Aaron Burr was kind of also running for president while running for vice president. And so when the vote went to Congress, this is part of the Constitution. If the Electoral College is unclear, then Congress gets to decide the winner. And after several votes, Alexander Hamilton, who is not in Congress but still has power in Congress, he had his friends vote for Jefferson. Now, Hamilton didn't like Burr, and he didn't like Jefferson. However, he basically said that Aaron Burr was what he called an embryo Caesar, that he was, a dictator in the making. And he said, while I don't like Thomas Jefferson, I at least don't think he's going to be as bad as Burr would be. This actually, like I said, led to the 12th Amendment, where we no longer have a president and then the runner-up be VP. Nowadays, if you vote for president of the United States, you're voting for both the president and their running mate. This also led to the duel, along with several other things, where Aaron Burr killed Alexander Hamilton. Burr then fled to the South, engaged in a plot to turn Kentucky into an independent nation, was put on trial for treason and found not guilty, and that is all while he's like vice president of the United States, basically. So now, according to some, he's the villain in your history. I don't know where I heard that before, but the election of 1800 did show that even if the parties did not like each other very much, we would have a peaceful transition of power, at least up until 1861. Even people who disagreed with each other agreed that we should continue this transition of governmental power. So here's Aaron Burr, sir, 1756 to 1836. He's from New Jersey. He was a senator. He was vice president. He was also a soldier during the American Revolution. He is the grandson of a fire and brimstone preacher named Jonathan Edwards, who wrote Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And he was actually put on trial for murder after killing Hamilton in that duel, but was let off on a technicality of the fact that he killed Hamilton in New Jersey, but was put on trial in New York. He was also tried for treason after trying to get several western states or territories to secede while vice president, and he was found not guilty on that because they said, well, what's the difference between treason and attempted treason, basically? And so here is Aaron Burr not throwing away his shot, and I believe that I'm almost completely out of Hamilton references, though I'll see, but we'll see about that. Don't bet the farm. So, let's also look at slavery and politics during this time. So Thomas Jefferson called his victory in 1800 the Revolution of 1800. We're bringing America back to its original sort of revolutionary ideals. However, lurking behind this whole thing is the question of slavery. Thomas Jefferson had become president because he received basically the entire electoral vote of the South. The slavery question would not go away during this time. In fact, also, Thomas Jefferson, one of the things the election of 1800 was a very dirty political fight. And one of the things that happened was that John Adams accused Thomas Jefferson of having a woman who was African American as his lover who had his children. And we just see this continues to not to go away. The question of slavery is just there, and it lingers and it builds. In 1787, we see the beginning of a first abolitionist group led by Benjamin Franklin, who actually wrote a letter to Congress asking them to abolish slavery. And this turned into a very divisive fight between the North and the South during this time. Also, there was the question of what if other enslaved people not in the United States start to ask for their independence, and what impact could this have? And we did see a revolution in Haiti in the 1790s. And this time it was black enslaved people who overthrew their white owners in Haiti during this time. And Jefferson and his followers were, think back to the French Revolution where Jefferson was like, yeah, revolution, they're following in our footsteps. And then he looked at the Haitians doing it and said, oh, revolution, they're not supposed to be the ones doing this. Um, it was also very close to home, and it could give our own enslaved people ideas, and that worried a lot of people. So this Haitian Revolution stoked a lot of fears of rumors and atrocities, and people started to hear rumors that I heard that down in Virginia the enslaved people rose up and killed their owners. And it also showed that liberty being called for in Republican countries usually meant that we're excited about white liberty, but when the Haitian former enslaved Haitians did it, it caused a lot more pause and concern. So here is Toussaint Louverture. He is. I apologize to every person who is French or speaks French anywhere. But he was a Haitian enslaved person who rose up to sort of lead this Haitian revolution. He was a general and a leader of the Haitian Revolution during this time. Now, we did see that some enslaved people were working to try to gain their freedom during this time. So, for instance, in 1800, there was an attempted rebellion in Virginia, Gabriel's Rebellion. Gabriel, who was an enslaved man, had a plan to kill or kidnap many Virginians, including the governor. And he hoped that a lot of poor whites would sort of join his cause, seeing them as sort of brothers in arms, like we're all oppressed. So join with us. He also used the American Revolution in his pamphlets to sort of get people riled up and say, like, this is what we're fighting for. We're fighting for liberty. This attempt failed, and Gabriel and his followers were arrested, and most of them were hanged. We do see that when things like this, when Gabriel's Rebellion and other events like this happen, we often see that there is a lot of heavy pushback from the American government. And we also see that attempts like this tighten the grip of the slave owners. It created more restrictive laws in the South, got people more angry, more upset, basically. So here's the location of Gabriel's execution. Gabriel and his men were pardoned by the governor of Virginia in 2007. Now, let's look at Jefferson during his time in office. So, Jefferson came to power with the idea of he wanted to reduce the size and the power of the federal government. So, he spent a lot of time cutting the power of the federal government, firing people who were not necessary. He also wanted to make sure that the power of his own political party would be in Washington, D.C. So, if we have a person who's a Federalist, replace him. Replace him with a Democratic Republican. He also got rid of the Alien and Sedition Acts to the thanks of everyone. He cut the size of the U.S. military, and over his 8 years, he also drastically reduced the size of the federal government. The one part that he couldn't seem to get rid of, though, is Hamilton's financial plan. That just stuck around, and he tried. So here's our third president, Thomas Jefferson. He is president from 1801 to 1809. He's from Virginia. He was a planter, an inventor, delegate to the Continental Congress, ambassador to France, governor of Virginia, secretary of state, and vice president before he became president. So he wore a lot of different hats. And interestingly enough, he also popularized ice cream in America. I think it might have been kind of more French at the time, but he brought it back over with him. Now, he also got rid of a lot of powerful Federalists, but there was one who he could not get rid of, and that was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Marshall. John Marshall was an incredibly powerful Federalist within the government, and his seat on the Supreme Court was a lifetime seat, and that gave him a lot of power to make decisions that could impact not only court cases, but also the federal government in a big way. He sat on the Supreme Court, and he used his bench to hand down rulings that mainly benefited the Federalists. And he used this to the process of what we call judicial review. And we'll talk about this more in a second. He also used the Supreme Court case Marbury v. Madison to do this sort of thing. So let's talk about judicial review for a minute. Well, first let's talk about John Marshall. Who is this guy? Very important guy. He was alive from 1755 to 1835. He is from Virginia. He was a former congressman and earlier on a Secretary of State. He had actually served in the Continental Army during the Revolution, and this is sort of what spurred his federalism. His idea of the big government is that, like, the state of Virginia didn't beat the British, America beat the British in his mind. He's also kind of sort of related to Thomas Jefferson, although the two did not get along. He is Thomas Jefferson's cousin by marriage, and he served a full 35 years as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Now, what is Marbury v. Madison? It's the law. The case itself is not as important as the law that it forms, but just as John Adams is leaving the White House, it was like really like the night before he left office. John Adams created a whole bunch of jobs for judges and justices of the peace. These guys got the nickname the Midnight Judges, and he did it right before he left office. However, people who worked for Jefferson refused to deliver these letters saying that you're hired, and so Jefferson said they shouldn't get their jobs. And one of these guys, a guy named William Marbury, actually sued to get his job. And John Marshall ruled that he did not have the power to give it to him. Now, the important part of this is that John Marshall just said the Supreme Court has the responsibility and the power to decide the constitutionality of actions of Congress and the president. That is huge. That is a power that did not exist before. John Marshall just created the power of judicial review, which is the power of the U.S. Supreme Court to decide the constitutionality of actions of both the president and Congress. That is, I cannot tell you, this is mind-blowingly immense. You can hear me getting excited about it. Judicial review is so important that we still look up to it today. This, by the way, is nowhere in the Constitution. Nowhere does it say that, the Supreme Court gets to decide constitutionality. Basically, the Constitution says there should be a Supreme Court, but we still use this idea of judicial review all the way up through today. Now, Marshall also used his power to rule on the bench for 35 years, and he almost always ruled in favor of the federal government. So we see in the case of Fletcher v. Peck, Marshall extended judicial review to say that we had the power, the Supreme Court had the power to decide constitutionality of state laws too. So remember the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. He said basically states cannot just ignore federal laws, and also that the Supreme Court got to decide federal laws. Now, what else happened during the Jefferson administration? Well, Jefferson's greatest achievement was doubling the size of the country. He bought the Louisiana Territory from Napoleon Bonaparte in 1803. Jefferson had been hoping to buy the city of New Orleans. He wanted to buy New Orleans from the French so that we could trade with it. He was actually quite surprised that Bonaparte said, how about instead of New Orleans, I give you the entire area of Louisiana for $15 million, which is a great deal. It is like a bargain basement price for that much land. And it was a great deal that Jefferson agreed to. However, he had agreed to this without the approval of Congress. And in doing so, he had technically violated the Constitution. However, he decided, I'm going to do it this one time just because it's so very worth it. So this is Thomas Jefferson, who believed in following the Constitution to the letter, technically violating the Constitution. Now, the only person who really cared about this violation of the Constitution was Thomas Jefferson himself. Everyone else was just like, buy the darn thing. It's a great deal. But he was sort of worried about it. So here's the Louisiana Purchase. Soon after purchasing it, Jefferson sent out Meriwether Lewis and William Clark to search for plant and animal life to see if the area was farmable. And Lewis, Clark, and their band of men left, partially men, band of about 50 left St. Louis in 1804, and they came back in 1806, having made it out of the Louisiana Territory into like the Pacific Ocean, still owned by other countries. Now, the one thing they didn't find was the thing that the French were looking for in the Northwest Passage. They did not find a water route to Asia like they had hoped. They were also aided by a woman named Sacagawea, which I'm saying probably incorrectly. Sacagawea was the wife of one of their expedition members. She was a translator, a diplomat, and an all around lifesaver for the trip. So here are Meriwether Lewis and William Clark and their dog, Seaman. Um, this is in St. Charles, Missouri. Um, William Meriwether Lewis actually dies soon after this of a people aren't sure if it's suicide or murder. William Clark actually becomes very important as a head of sort of like the Western expansion, and he dealt a lot with Native Americans and stuff like that. And so here's Sacagawea. She was alive from 1788 to 1812, we believe. She was born in what is modern day Idaho. She was married to a trapper named Toussaint Charbonneau at about the age of 13. She was a translator and a guide for Lewis and Clark, even though she was traveling with her newborn, nicknamed Pompey. Pompey actually went to the brand new St. Louis University High School, my alma mater. He was a slew boy. He was a junior Billiken back before we were junior Bills. Now, some urban legends say she lived to be almost 100 after leaving her husband. Most people think she died pretty early, actually. So here's the path of both Lewis and Clark. Now, Jefferson was a little less successful with other foreign deals that he was trying to make. First of all, although he had cut the size of our army and cut the size of our navy, he actually had to rebuild our navy after our ships were attacked in North Africa by ships of the Barbary pirates, basically these North African principalities and pashas run by Islamic leaders. This is what we call the Barbary Wars. Even more worrisome was the war between England and France, which had become an official war, the Napoleonic Wars in 1803. And while we were neutral, Britain didn't view us as very neutral, and so Britain started to stop our ships and steal our sailors, again, known as impressment, and forcing the sailors into the British Navy. So here is some of the Barbary Wars. Stephen Decatur, the guy with at front and center with the kind of widow's peak. He was a possible presidential contender, and then he died in a duel later on. And you can still see his ghost in Washington, D.C., allegedly. Now, in response to the British taking our sailors and firing at our ships, Jefferson created an embargo, which is a ban on trade between us and Great Britain. And this embargo act stopped America not just from trading with Great Britain, but he decided, you know what? We're not going to trade with any country, hoping that it would stop all other countries, Britain, France, everybody, from attacking our ships and recognize us as a full on neutral party. However, it had the opposite effect. It mainly hurt American trade, and it made all of our people mad, England, France, everybody. And right before he left office in 1809, Jefferson actually got rid of most of the Embargo Act, just restricting it to Britain and France. And even then, it wouldn't last very long. In fact, right after Jefferson left office, his close friend and ally, James Madison, very quickly defeated the other Federalists who were gunning for his job. The Federalists at this party were kind of running out of steam. And Madison adapted the Embargo Act again, basically saying, whichever side, Britain or France, stops stealing our ships first, we will only embargo the other country. And so France did it first. France said, yes, we'll stop stealing your people. And so England actually increased their impressment, but France stopped messing with our ships. So we have our fourth president, James Madison, president from 1809 to 1817. He is again from Virginia, noticing a trend here. He was a delegate to the Confederation Congress. He was a congressman. He was Jefferson's Secretary of State, and he is our smallest president. He was about 5'4" and weighed a little over 100 pounds soaking wet. So he's our carry-on sized president. Now, meanwhile, we see a new generation of politicians were starting to call for America to go to war with Britain again. We beat them in 1776. Let's do it again in 1812. These newer, younger, kind of post-Revolutionary War Americans, a lot of them, really did not like Great Britain. They saw Great Britain as the enemy, and so these guys who got the nickname War Hawks included the most powerful man in Congress, a guy named Henry Clay of Kentucky, and also John C. Calhoun of South Carolina. And as part of this battle that they were instigating, they were calling for, they also wanted an invasion of Canada. They also wanted to invade Florida, even though that was Spanish, but Spain was allied with Britain. Basically, they still held on to this idea that we saw it back in the American Revolution, that Canada is somehow just being held hostage by Great Britain. They want to join us, they just don't realize it yet. Didn't quite work. So let's look at the Second War of Independence. Along with Great Britain at sea, we were also having trouble with Native Americans in the West. The Louisiana Purchase started to increase the number of people heading out west. And so the plan was either we are going to buy that land from Native Americans or we're just going to straight up take that land from Native Americans. And very soon the American settlers outnumbered the number of Native Americans. And we start to see that some Native Americans who are viewed as sort of political and religious leaders, sometimes called prophets, preached that we should, they should return to Native American traditional beliefs, fight against this civilization offered by American settlers and the God of the American missionaries. Two of the top missionaries, prophets, were Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa, two Shawnee brothers. Tenskwatawa is actually sometimes nicknamed the Prophet. And they basically said Native Americans should abandon the ways of whites. They should create an alliance of all Native tribes, bring together all the remaining tribes into a huge, powerful tribe to resist this sort of American encroachment on their territory. And Tecumseh called for attacks on American settlements, and the Americans fought back. Eventually, Tecumseh and his men were defeated by future President William Henry Harrison in what is called the Battle of Tippecanoe. This got Harrison his nickname of Old Tippecanoe. And so here are Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa. Tecumseh once said, "Show respect to all people, but grovel, kneel to none." Now, with the British attacking our ships, with the British sort of instigating and inspiring the natives in the West to rebel against the Americans, Madison did declare war against England in 1812. Now, the War of 1812 was not unanimous, and Madison did have to go to Congress and get them to say yes to this war. The Northeast did not like it, however, the South and the West were okay with it, and so we did go to war in the War of 1812. Now, England was mainly focused on battle with France. So for a while, we were sort of like this sideshow. However, the war did not start well for America. We had very little army and navy. Remember, Jefferson had gotten rid of most of the army and the navy, and now we realized how much we needed one. We had very little money, and when we attacked Canada, it turned out that they were pretty happy where they were, thank you, and we were rebuffed, violently rebuffed. We did have some success on the Great Lakes, where a small American fleet did defeat the British Navy. However, things got really bad for us after the British defeated Napoleon, because now they're like, hey, we can focus all of our attention on America now. And so they landed troops in Maryland and walked up to Washington, D.C. and burned the Capitol to the ground. We don't talk about this very much, but the U.S. Capitol was, the U.S., Washington, D.C. was mainly burned to the ground in 1814, with just a few buildings that lasted after that. However, after fleeing Washington, D.C., they made it to Baltimore, but were defeated at the Battle of Fort McHenry, trying to take the city of Baltimore and the fort that sort of defended Baltimore. The lawyer, Francis Scott Key, actually watched the battle, and after the battle was over, saw our flag still flying over Fort McHenry, and he wrote the Star-Spangled Banner to celebrate that victory. So here is the British burning the White House. You can still see the char marks left from the War of 1812 and soot stains on the White House building. And here is the Battle of Fort McHenry with the flag still flying. And here is the actual Fort McHenry flag. If you go to the Smithsonian in D.C., you can see the original Fort McHenry flag that was the Star-Spangled Banner flag. Now, we were also fighting natives in the West, where we saw William Henry Harrison, the hero of Tippecanoe, and Andrew Jackson winning battles against Tecumseh and other Native American allies of the British. Jackson also became a hero in the War of 1812 after he stopped a British attack in New Orleans in 1815. The Battle of New Orleans is one of the great victories of the War of 1812, which is weird because it was fought after the war was over. The problem was we just didn't realize it. Britain and America had officially signed a peace treaty in December of 1814 at what's called the Treaty of Ghent. Unfortunately, that news did not make it back to America until the battle was already over. So the big decisive battle was actually after we had already declared peace. So here's Andrew Jackson at the Battle of New Orleans with his band of men. He only lost a few dozen. The British lost many, many more. Now, what's the aftermath? Some people say the War of 1812 is the Second War of Independence. It confirmed our ability, it confirmed our sort of right to be a republic. And we could fight a war, we could win a war without becoming a monarchy. It also helped to solidify America's hold on the land of the Louisiana Purchase. We held on to that land. We also eliminated a lot of the competition by taking out a lot of the Native Americans. The war also did increase the belief in an American identity, the idea that we were something new, we were something different, something special and unique from European countries, and that meant that we had different books and different plays, different paintings. We were an all-new country. Now, it also killed the Federalist Party. At the beginning of the war, with America not doing very well, the Federalist Party saw their fortunes increase, actually. So at first, when it looked like America might lose the War of 1812, the Federalists were overjoyed. In December of 1814, the Federalists met in Hartford, Connecticut, and they said, look, it looks like we're going to lose. We're the ones in power here. We have a couple of demands in order to keep fighting this war, including getting rid of the 3/5 clause of the U.S. Constitution. They didn't want presidents to be from the same state anymore, that we had too many Democratic Republicans from Virginia, basically. And also, they were even talking about if we don't get what we want, we might just break away and maybe even give ourselves back to Great Britain. And news of this Hartford Convention broke right after we heard about Andrew Jackson winning the battle for New Orleans. So it was the poorest timed convention in the history of conventions. It made it look like the Federals were either cowards or traitors, that they were at least giver-uppers. And the Federalist Party kind of died after the War of 1812. And this would solidify Democratic Republican control in America for many years following this.